Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 129, Henry VI, Part 3, How Sweet a Thing It Is to Wear a Crown. Just before we get started on today's episode, in case you don't make it to those few minutes at the end of the show where I do the housekeeping announcements, I wanted to let you know that, if you're listening in real time, the website has recently had a complete update. Please do go and take a look at it. I hope you'll agree that it has a much more streamlined look and feel and is easier to navigate around. If you listen from the player on the website, you will find that new episodes are updated there as soon as they are released to the podcast app feed, which is usually early on a Monday morning UK time. That feature on the old website was a little, erratic. Another changed feature is that on the new website, you will also find that the guest profiles and links are now on the same page as the podcast episode they appeared in, rather than being on a separate guest page. The website address is the same as always, www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com. And I hope you like the new look. Please let me know what you think, especially if there's something that you think would be useful to have online that I've missed. And now, it's on with Henry VI, Part 3. Last time, when I discussed what we now call Part 2 of the Henry VI trilogy, I detailed the issues with the dating and the sources of the play, so I'll only cover those briefly here to remind you, and then I'll talk about Part 3 specifically. Although there's no documentary proof, scholars generally agree that Part 2 and 3 were written as a pair, probably in 1591, as by 1592, Robert Greene felt confident enough to quote a line from Part 3 in his rant about the upstart Shakespeare, actor turned playwright, confident enough that it would be recognised by some at least. The sources of the play are Holingshed's Chronicles and Holingshed's own source, Edward Hall's The Union of the Two Noble and Illustrious Families of Lancaster and York, published in 1548. In addition to this, some detail from Richard Grafton's A Chronicle at Large, published in 1569, are also used. For Part 3 in particular, it seems likely that Shakespeare had a copy of the play Gorboduc close at hand. You will remember that this is a very early history play, written for performances by law students at the Inns of Court by Sackville and Norton in 1561. You can revisit episode 94 to hear all the detail about that play. It had been reprinted in 1590, so it's reasonable to think that Shakespeare had access to the text as he was writing his Henry VI plays. There's one scene in particular in Gorboduc that seems to have caught Shakespeare's eye. This is where a son kills his own father without realising who it is, and a father kills his son in the same circumstances. Before Shakespeare's use of the scene, Gorboduc is the only known play to use this image as a representation of the destruction of society thanks to the factional fighting of the nobility. Shakespeare's version of these events is in Act 2 of Part 3. He would of course return to Gorboduc as a source when he came to write his version of the King Lear myth. It's also suggested that Kyd's Spanish tragedy is being pilfered for the image of the blood-soaked handkerchief, a recurring image in Kyd's play, and in Shakespeare's it's used by Margaret to torment York as she indicates the fate of his son Rutland. It also looks like Shakespeare lifted, almost word for word, a speech from Arthur Brooke's The Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet, published in 1562. Where Friar Lawrence encourages Romeus to be brave in the face of danger. This work was Shakespeare's source for Romeo and Juliet, written just a few years after the Henry VI plays, but in this case it is part of Margaret's speech in Act 5, Scene 4, where the words used are very close to those used by the friar. It has also been suggested that there was some direct lifting of text from Thomas More's play The History of King Richard III, first performed in 1518. Some scholars have pointed out that Shakespeare may have been thinking back to the religious cycle plays in his depiction of the torture of York in Act 1, which bears some resemblance to the torture of Christ as depicted in the play The Buffeting and the Scourging of Christ. Although cycle plays were becoming less performed by the 1590s, they were certainly still part of the actor's toolkit and would have been known to Shakespeare as a player and from seeing them performed in his childhood. So some latent influence, if not access to still existing play scripts, is certainly possible. Once again, I'll give just a brief synopsis of the play in case you're not familiar with the historical detail as represented on stage. You will remember that Part 2 ended with the Battle of St Albans, where Henry's men were routed and he and Margaret were forced to flee to London, while Warwick proclaimed that York would be king. As this play opens, York, his sons and Warwick force their way into Henry's throne room. York negotiates with Henry who, in the face of Warwick's forces, agrees to name York as his successor, thus disinheriting his own son Edward, if York will allow him to live out the rest of his life as king. York agrees, knowing that he will have power and rule in all but name until the king's death, and can then establish his own dynasty. Margaret is furious at Henry's agreement and raises an army in the name of her son. York is persuaded by his sons to break his oath to the king and takes up arms against Margaret's army. Rutland, York's youngest son, is killed in cold blood by Clifford in revenge for York's killing of his father. Margaret's men capture York during the Battle of Wakefield. They ridicule him by placing a paper crown on his head, torture him with the sight of his own son's blood, and then kill him. Warwick reports the recent losses to York's sons, but declares that Edward will prevail and be crowned king. As the fighting continues, Henry contemplates his unhappy life and declining kingdom. He sees a son unknowingly kill his own father on the battlefield, and a father unknowingly kill his own son. Two gamekeepers capture Henry and hand him over to Edward. The new king hears the pleas of Lady Grey for her dead husband's lands. Struck by her beauty, he resolves to make her his queen against the advice of his brothers. Margaret is at the French court asking for support when Warwick arrives with the offer of the king's hand for Lady Bona, daughter of the Duke of Savoy. The offer is accepted by the French king, but when news of Edward's marriage to Lady Grey arrives, Warwick is humiliated, breaks with Edward and joins Margaret. Clarence, Edward's brother, joins Warwick. They surprise Edward in his camp and capture him. Lady Grey, now Queen Elizabeth, fearing for the lives of her children, flees to sanctuary. Warwick frees Henry, who then turns over the government to him and Clarence. Richard frees Edward, and they retake the city of York. Edward returns to London and, finding him unguarded, recaptures the king. They prepare to fight Warwick at Coventry. As the opposing troops arrive for the battle, Clarence again changes his allegiance, joining with Edward and Richard. But Warwick decides to fight on and leads his men to Barnet, where he is killed. The triumphant Yorkists prepare to face Margaret at Tewkesbury. Richard steals away to kill the imprisoned Henry and begins to scheme his own way to the throne. Edward captures Margaret and her son and then plays a part in killing the young prince. Victory is celebrated as the play ends with shows of loyalty to Edward's infant son, but Richard lurks, biding his time. So, this is another play that more or less follows historical events and expects its audience to be able to follow the changing allegiances of many characters. The play is dominated by the activities of the military forces as they move back and forth across England, but who cannot retain the crown for long until the very end of the play. This play, more than the two earlier parts, is about how a kingdom becomes diminished and destabilised as families become enemies, even within themselves, to the point where a son can kill his father and a father can kill his own son. In the face of spiralling revenge and a lust for power, morality itself begins to break down. Praise and criticism of the play, not surprisingly, very much follows the lines established over Part 2. There are more battle scenes in this play, 4 on stage and 1 reported, than any other Shakespeare play. So for those like Philip Sidney, who followed the neoclassical argument that showing battles was a failing on the part of the dramatist, this must have been an even worse example than Part 2. The contention was that it showed more skill of the dramatist to have his characters report and describe battles than to show them, so that doing so was a vulgarisation of the art, and displayed an inability of the poet to develop his source material. Here, we should note that this criticism is coming from a very upper-class poet, Sir Philip Sidney, and the conflation of dramatist, my word, and poet, his word, there is intentional and, I think, telling. Sidney criticises Gorboduc for the same fault, showing that he was focusing on theatre as a form of poetry, his own forte, rather than as an art form concerned with both poetry and dramatic action. Perhaps Shakespeare was consciously rebelling against the static poetic play and was experimenting with what could be shown on stage. Either that or his inexperience as a dramatist was indeed showing through. Either way, I think he did learn a lesson. His later history plays dealing with turbulent times in England, Richard II and, particularly, the two parts of Henry IV and, of course, Henry V, are much less violent and mimetic in their depiction of warfare. Sidney wasn't alone in this view. Ben Jonson, closer to Shakespeare as a dramatist but still rather interested in how theatre could be high art, agreed when he said that showing battles on stage was only for the vulgar, who are better delighted with that which pleaseth the eye than contenteth the ear. Jonson's view of history plays generally, that they were drum and trumpet stuff, set the tone for future academic criticism. Jonson then went further in his criticism when, in his preface to his play Every Man in His Humour, he got specific about the Henry VI plays, characterising them as when three rusty swords fight over Lancaster and York's long wars. The view of these plays being vulgar and rough-edged was carried forward into the 18th century criticism as the neoclassical vogue gained ground, and have only been somewhat recovered after that, as I described in the episode about Part 2. However, in defence of the play, it has been argued that Jonson here confuses poor staging with the artistic intent of the play, where showing so much violence could be seen as being used to emphasise the effect of civil war on innocent people. In this reading, the scene where the king sees a son unwittingly kill his father and a father unknowingly kill his son is the absolute centre of the play. Whether this is played realistically, with the king holed up on a corner of the battlefield, or symbolically, perhaps as the king experiencing a dream sequence, it is a symbolic rendering of the bitterest effects of war. But whatever Jonson thought, there is every reason to believe that the plays were popular in their time. Thomas Nash crops up again here, praising battles depicted on stage, although his contention that such displays were a good way of teaching men the tactics of battlefield fighting seems a little far-fetched. As he said, "Our forefathers' valiant acts, that have lain so long in rusty brass and worm-eaten books, are revived." Nash wasn't alone. Thomas Hayward put in a good word for the benefits of some action scenes in a play. So bewitching a thing is lively and well-spirited action, that it hath power to new mould the hearts of the spectators, and fashion them to the shape of any noble and notable attempt. The movement of the representative armies back and forth across the stage, each side costumed in distinctive liveries, can help to anchor the action of the play, the rival sides claiming ascendancy or declining, depending on their fortunes of the moment. The language of the play often enforces the idea of power moving backwards and forwards from camp to camp across the country. When sitting alone as the Battle of Towton is fought, Henry sums up the clash of the equally opposed forces by comparing them to the effect of the tide and the wind on the ocean. This battle fares like to the morning's war, when dying clouds contend with growing light. What time the shepherd, blowing on his nails, can neither call it perfect day or night, nor sways it this way like the mighty sea, forced by the tide to combat with the wind. Now sways it this way, like the selfsame sea, forced to retire by fury of the wind. Sometime the flood prevails, and then the wind. Now one the better, then another best, both tugging to be victors, breast to breast. Yet neither conqueror nor conquered, so is the equal poise of this fell war. However, there can be no doubt that the fact that the play includes 4 battles presents a production challenge. How can each battle be made to be distinctive and advance the play? It is a conundrum that a director and a designer of a production need to face head-on, and I don't think there are easy answers. Perhaps one of the most striking things about this play is the way a number of characters who are apparently subservient to Edward and Henry catch our attention. Margaret, Warwick and Richard all have dramatic roles in an unfolding plot, but also stand out as individuals. Warwick, the would-be kingmaker, first champions York, apparently accepting the truth of his claim to the throne. He only switches sides when Edward betrays him badly by marrying Lady Grey while Warwick is on the diplomatic mission to France to arrange a dynastic marriage for the king, a marriage that would have tied the French and English thrones and, in theory at least, brought a permanent peace with France. This is betrayal on an enormous scale, not only of Warwick, but of the whole country. Warwick's decision to switch his allegiance is, not surprisingly, swift and brutal. This is behaviour driven by the old codes of chivalry and honour, and his decision to continue to fight once Clarence has abandoned him only reinforces that those codes are lacking elsewhere. His reward is to briefly become the effective Lancastrian ruler of the country. But his end is on the battlefield, like so many others. This play is drenched in blood, violence and cruelty, but it also reeks of betrayal and broken oaths. King Henry remains something of a problem in this play, as he did in Part 2. Early on we hear that he has fled the battlefield, following which Margaret and the lords keep him away from the fighting in case his weakness infects the troops. He is the antithesis of what a medieval king was supposed to be. Some scholars have gone so far as to say that it is Henry's weakness and coolness, his aesthetic of pious rather than muscular Christianity, that prevented the plays from being performed much during the 19th and 20th centuries. For a country that headed a great empire, and after its ending lived off the memory of it, Henry was just too passive and weak for a leader to be popular. But there is another way of looking at Shakespeare's intentions with Henry. The play shows the Lancastrians and the Yorkists in an escalating cycle of revenge, an eye for an eye in the Old Testament mode. The cold-blooded killing of Rutland by Clifford in revenge for his father's death at York's hand is a hard watch. But then things get even worse as Margaret uses the child's blood to taunt York before killing him in front of her own son. Henry wants no part of this and stands aloof, but is this weakness? As an almost Christ-like figure, he sees another way, one of honesty, forgiveness and negotiation. His very first plea to York in the play is for Parliament to have its authority restored, for the rule of law to be re-established. He does go as far as to say that he will fight for his kingdom, but he is well aware of his own failings and acknowledges that he lacks the legal argument in his defence and, from a practical point of view, he has no body of supporters who agree with his vision. In these circumstances, he invites the audience to consider if gaining political control through warfare really will resolve the country's issues. That message is only reinforced when Margaret more or less forces Henry to knight his son, and Henry is keen to point out to Edward that he should only draw thy sword in right. Violence in the name of the rule of law is the only violence that Henry can support. But for all those around him, ambition and revenge outweigh all other arguments. And I'm again drawn to this scene where the king sees fathers and sons at war with each other. It is this experience of war fought by the common people that confirms Henry in his non-violent approach, but goes even deeper than that when the son says over his father's body, "From London by the king was I pressed forth. My father, being the Earl of Warwick's men, came on the part of York, pressed by his master." Meaning that he was forced, pressed, to fight for the Lancastrians, while his father was similarly forced into Warwick's men for the York side. It illustrates a divide by geography, allegiance, and across generations, But as impressment was still a tool used by the government to fill their armies in the 1580s and the 1590s, it probably also spoke keenly to men who had been forced into an army and relations who were still missing sons and husbands who were still serving. Henry holds to his beliefs in the face of increasing dangers and never resorts to calling war God's punishment, as St. Augustine did in his very influential writings. Henry is more in line with the emerging Renaissance period humanists who saw war as man-made evil that could be avoided in all matters except as self-defence. The revenge motive leads to death upon death, and even when the Yorkist faction is on the brink of victory, it is still revenge that drives them. Warwick says to Edward, "From off the gates of York fetch down the head, your father's head, which Clifford placed there. Instead whereof let this supply the room. Measure for measure must be answered." And Edward will still take no quarter. Bring forth that fatal screech owl to our house, that nothing sung but death to us and ours. Now death shall stop his dismal threatening sound, and his ill-boding tongue no more shall speak. I spoke at length about Margaret when discussing part 2, and all I said there still applies here, so I won't labour the point further. But just to say that Margaret is shown to be as powerful in her way as Warwick is in his. She continues her role as the driving force of the Lancastrian fight to retain the throne in the name of her son, and after the defeat of her English army, she travels to the French court to plead for support there. It is in this play that she is called the she-wolf of France, as she allows York to speak before his death. The killing of her son destroys her, but it was she who waved the cloth filled with the child Rutland's blood in front of York, so sympathy is in short supply. She is as tough and as hypocritical as the rest of them, and the charge of unwomanliness sticks. As York says, "She-wolf of France, but worse than wolves of France, whose tongue is more poisonous than an adder's tooth. How ill-beseeming it is in thy sex to triumph like an Amazonian trull upon their woes whom fortune captivates. But that thou face is vizard-like unchanging, made imprudent with use of evil deeds, I would essay, proud queen, to make thee blush, to tell thee of whence thou camest, of whom derived. Were shame enough to shame thee, wert thou not shameless." And so it goes on. It is interesting that Shakespeare ignores true history here. The death of her son and the defeat at Tewkesbury marked the end of any ambitions Margaret had. After Henry's death, she was held under house arrest until she was ransomed to the French king. She lived out her days in France in quite impoverished circumstances for a former queen, as a poor relation of the king. But Shakespeare, I think, knew when he had a good character on his hands, and saved Margaret to bring her back in Richard III. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, inevitably draws our attention as Shakespeare slowly begins to draw the portrait of him. Even in this play, he is both attractive and repellent. We are conscious of his energy, his self-awareness and his ruthless nature. The famous deformity gets an early mention. His tone suggests that he is bitter about it, to say the least, and it is the root cause of his inability to care about others. Richard's soliloquy in Act 3, Scene 2 gives us this self-reflection, and, perhaps significantly, it is the longest soliloquy in all of Shakespeare's plays. Once again, it seems like Shakespeare really liked this character. Richard expresses his exasperation at how Edward has squandered a diplomatic coup in marrying a French princess for a love match, and an impulsive one at that. That, in the context of expectations of a royal marriage at the time, is not an unreasonable view, but he then goes on to personalise his frustrations by showing his jealousy of Edward's ability to function in society and with women, two things which he has not been able to succeed in. Aye, Edward will use women honourably. Would he were wasted, marrow, bones and all, that from his loins no hopeful branch may spring to cross me from the golden time I look for. And yet, between my soul's desire and me, the lustful Edward's title buried is Clarence, Henry, and his son young Edward. and all the unlooked-for issue of their bodies, to take their rooms ere I can place myself, a cold premeditation of my purpose. Why, then, I do but dream on sovereignty, like one that stands upon a promontory, and spies a far-off shore where he would tread, wishing his foot were equal with his eye, and chides the sea that sunders him from thence, saying he'll lade it dry to have his way. Warming to his theme, Richard expounds on how none of this is his fault. His destiny was written in the stars, with a list of the evil omens at his birth, and the physical evidence of his tortured body. Why, love forswore me in my mother's womb, and, for I should not deal in her soft laws, she did corrupt frail nature with some bribe, to shrink mine arm up like the withered stub, to make an envious mountain on my back where sits deformity to mock my body, to shape my legs of unequal size, to disproportion me in every part, like to a chaos or an unlicked bear whelp, that carries no impression like the dam. And am I then a man to be beloved? The eternal question of how deformed Shakespeare's version of Richard really is rears its head here. Is this literal, or is Richard expressing the exaggeration of his own perception of his condition to justify his actions? Whatever the case, in Richard's mind, these events are outside of his control, which excuses any moral concerns for his actions. And in his way of thinking, if he can gain political power, then he can hope to redress the imbalance in his life. Is this a psychopath justifying and normalising his extreme actions? It seems to be the beginning of that path, and, whatever the historical truth, Shakespeare draws a convincing character, even if he wouldn't have expressed his construction in those terms. As the speech reaches its end, he makes his intention clear. He says he will torment myself to catch the English crown, and from that torment I will free myself, or hew my way out with a bloody axe. Why, I can smile and murder while I smile, and cry content to that which grieves my heart, and wet my cheeks with artificial tears, and fame my face for all occasions. I'll drown more sailors than the mermaid shall, I'll slay more gazers than the basilisk, I'll play the orator as well as Nestor, deceive more slyly than Ulysses could, and, like a Sinon, take another Troy. I can add colours to the chameleon, change shapes with Proteus for advantages, and set the murderous Machiavel to school. Can I do this, and cannot get a crown? Tut! Were it further off, I'll pluck it down. You see, like Shakespeare, I'm caught in Richard's spell. But enough of him for now. There is much more still to come, but that is for another day. The question of how much the subject of these plays resonated with the original audience is an interesting one. For the audience in, let's say, 1591, the events depicted started 136 years ago and ended 101 years ago, so they were out of living memory by at least 2 or maybe 3 generations. Shakespeare's own grandfather was born in 1490, 3 years after the end of the Wars of the Roses, and had died probably 30 years before his grandson started dramatically documenting them. But did their influence and memory linger on? Most scholars think they probably did. The Tudor dynasty had a clear and present fear of civil war, and the tensions between noble families still existed, albeit that alternative claims to the throne were now religiously as well as politically motivated. I've seen it suggested that the folk memory of the War of the Roses as a presence in the 1590s may have been comparable to the way that the memory of the Vietnam War hung over America for decades. I think it's also useful to remember that many in the audience would have fought in battle themselves, maybe from Henry VIII's French campaigns, or in the more recent expeditions to the Low Countries and to Ireland. Many others will have been personally affected, caring for injured relatives or grieving for those who didn't return from those expeditions. This was a society that was used to seeing the effects of violence, and let's not forget that Londoners saw rotting heads of traitors displayed on the city gates every time they came and went from the city. The play is incredibly violent, but it was playing to people who were, to some extent at the very least, aware of political and military violence on a day-to-day basis. The flowing of stage blood, the dramatic death scenes, the charge of armed men across the stage was, I think, holding a mirror for the audience and much more necessary for the entertainment value of the plays than we might think. Perhaps what is more surprising than the violence depicted in this play is that in the later history plays, Shakespeare was able to tone down the violence and the bloodshed to the extent that he did, and he still managed to engage with his audience. By ending the play on a note of celebration, but with Richard undercutting that celebration with the promise of his scheming, Shakespeare leaves us in no doubt that these conflicts are not over yet. The Lancastrian line may be defeated, but now the threat comes from within the York household. The end of the play is less bleak than that for Part 1 or Part 2, as the conflicts to come will not ravage the country. But for those in the world of the court, well, watch out. However, it is a stretch to call it an optimistic ending, not just because of the shadow of Richard hanging over the victory celebrations, but because the dark world of medieval England overshadows the few expressions of hope for a society based on the function of law and more humanistic thought that the play quietly espouses. Next time, we continue with Shakespeare's next play, where he brings Richard III fully to life. The question is, do we watch with horror and disgust, or amazement and conspiratorial laughter, as Richard schemes his way to the top, and then comes crashing down as the Tudor dynasty is born? Perhaps it's a little of all of these things, and quite a lot more. In the meantime, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or X to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. New episodes there are continuing the story of the criticism of Shakespeare through the centuries, but you also get immediate access to all of the back episodes too. You can find details of ways to support the podcast at the shiny new website, which is www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or via X at thoetp.